Welcome to In This Body, a podcast where we dive deep into the potent power of embodiment. I'm your host, Ailey Jolie, a psychotherapist deeply passionate about living life fully from the wisdom within your very own body. The podcast In This Body is a love letter to embodiment, a podcast dedicated to asking important questions like, how does connecting to your body change your life? How does connecting to your body enhance your capacity to love more deeply and live more authentically? And how can collective embodiment alter the course of our shared world? Join me for consciously curated conversations with leading experts. Each episode is intended to support you in reconnecting to your very own body. This podcast will be available for free wherever you get your podcasts, making it easy for you to stay connected to In This Body, the podcast with me, Ailey Jolie. Welcome to In This Body. Today's guest is someone whose work dives deep into the deepest layers of our emotional and relational lives. Dr. Galit Atlas is a psychoanalyst, clinical supervisor, and faculty member at NYU's postdoctoral program in psychotherapy and psychoanalysis. She is the author of the widely acclaimed books Emotional Inheritance, A Therapist for Patients and the Legacy of Trauma, and a professional book for therapists, The Enigma of Desire, Sex, Longing, and Belonging in Psychoanalysis. In her work, Dr. Atlas explores the profound connections between desire, sexuality, life, death, pain, and the unconscious. Her writing brings to light how the ghosts of our family history shape our bodies, relationships, and the way we navigate intimacy. She has an extraordinary ability to combine clinical insights with personal storytelling, inviting readers and clients alike to uncover the hidden layers of their lives. Today, we'll explore her latest book, Emotional Inheritance, which now has a workbook. This book explains how the lives of our family members live on in us, shaping our emotions, behaviors, our bodies, and the choices we do and do not make. We'll also spend time exploring concepts that are held within the book, The Enigma of Desire, where Dr. Atlas invites us to consider the mysterious and pragmatic aspects of sexuality, longing, and human bonds. This is a book that is a personal favorite of mine. Dr. Atlas, it's such an honor to have you here with me today. Welcome to In This Body, the podcast with me, Ailey Jolie. The first question I have for you today is, what does being in your body mean to you?
Being in my body, I think the main thing for me is that it means recognizing your emotions. Because I find, as a psychoanalyst and someone who works with emotions, that all of our emotions are in our body and they give us the clue to what's happening. So really the feelings and the physical sensations are connected.
This ties into pieces of your book, Emotional Inheritance, which really dives into the aspect and how we inherit our experiences from our families. For the listener who is new to your work in this book, could you explain what emotional inheritance is and why it's so crucial for our ability and capacity to understand ourselves?
Emotional inheritance is the idea that experiences, and especially raw and unprocessed ones, inevitably pass down from generation to generation. You know, in some ways, it's a controversial idea. And in other ways, it's an idea that psychoanalysis is familiar with for many, many, many years, actually, since after World War II, with the second generation. And what we're talking really about is about emotions, memories, feelings, and traumatic experiences that are transmitted from one generation to the next and becomes part of their children's life, their grandchildren's life, conscious and unconscious minds. So what it means is that we carry experiences that are not only our own, but our parents and grandparents'.
I'm curious to hear from you the differences between the language of emotional inheritance and intergenerational trauma. Because when you speak of emotional inheritance, in my mind, there's such a neutrality of both the wisdom and maybe some of the pain and the benefits and all those pieces. But I would love to hear if there's a reason or a rationale that makes emotional inheritance different than intergenerational trauma.
It's a really good question. And you are right, because in the book, I don't use only intergenerational trauma or ideas about trauma, because what I present is the idea that we inherit emotions, not only traumatic emotions, right? But actually everything that is not fully processed, not fully recognized. I talk a lot in the book about ghosts and these experiences, the ghostly experiences, the unsaid and the unspeakable. So many times those are related to trauma, because trauma is one of the most difficult things to process. There is no such a thing as, in general, fully processing experiences, right? I mean, it's a therapeutic fantasy that we fully process things, right? But I'm really talking here about things that becomes more dissociated in our experiences. And so when I talk about emotional inheritance, in the book, I really focus on not only traumatic experiences, but any previous generation experience, unfinished business, I'll call it, that leads us to become who we are. Any experiences that our ancestors had that created who we are, that we, to some degree, and I use the word inherit.
Can you speak more to kind of the ghostly or unspoken? Maybe an example from the book or another clinical example for the listener whose curiosity has maybe been piqued by what you mean by ghostly experience.
So, I think that it's a very, how I'm sure we'll talk about it in my book for clinician, The Enigma of Desire is one of my books for clinicians. I have a few of them, but in that book, I really define the difference between the enigmatic and the pragmatic. And here in this book, I really continue talking about enigmatic experiences, those experiences that have no form, and I think that's why I used the metaphor of ghosts, because it is very, very difficult to put the enigmatic into words. That doesn't have form, doesn't have shape, doesn't have smell necessarily, right? But you feel it nevertheless. And I think that is what the book Emotional Inheritance is talking about, as the experiences the emotional experience is usually something, the emotional inheritance is usually something that comes into our life in enigmatic ways. So it's a very good question, because I think, like, I'll give you one example from the book, okay? I'll start maybe with the first chapter I wrote for the book Emotional Inheritance, before I even knew that I'm going to write a book, was the Noah chapter. I think it's chapter 5, I'm not sure. And now I wrote it in 2014, and I wrote it as a piece for the New York Times about therapy and about these mysterious things that happen in therapy. And I was getting my patient that I called Noah, which was a name he gave himself for this piece, permission to tell his story that both of us thought was a very unusual story. And I'll tell you briefly. The story was that Noah came to therapy. He's a 40-year-old man. He came to therapy because of what he called bizarre thoughts about dead people. Basically, what that meant is that Noah was obsessed, as he called it, with obituaries. And he used to read obituaries. And now, between me and you, kind of secretly, I love reading obituaries too. And I find a lot of people are fascinated by the obituaries, and we can talk about why. But when he came in and he said he has this intense need to read obituaries and he talked about his fantasy that that he used to have a twin brother who died in birth. And he shared with me that this was fantasy that he had all his life, and he shared this with his mother, and his mother used to get really upset at him and say, like, stop with these bizarre fantasies, enough, and she would get angry. To make this long story shorter, and maybe to spoil it a little bit for your listeners, years pass. I describe in the chapter our work together and how we process those really, unclear thoughts, fantasies, and feelings. And his mother dies, and I get an email from him saying something really unbelievable happened. My mother passed away today, and I found that I had a brother who died. He was not a twin. He was a brother who died before Noah was born. And Noah was named after his dead brother, who was also named Noah. And then, I wrote this piece, I published it in the New York Times. And an hour after it was out, I started getting, I cannot even tell you how many emails from people who told me similar stories. So what I thought was a very unusual, and Noah and I thought a very unusual experience became something that I started processing as something that happens to a lot of people. What that means is that it's not necessarily about a brother, and it's not, but it's about secrets in our families, secrets from before we were born, secrets from previous generations, of course, that we kind of know, but but we don't really know how we know. And they impact our life, but we don't really know how they impact our life and how that happens. And I can tell you a little bit about that process that I had from writing the book to just publishing a workbook to explain to people a little bit more about, let's call it the mechanism with quotation mark, as if there is a mechanism, right? Of how does it happen? It's so strange that it happens. But all clinicians, and I would love to hear your experience, right? But all clinicians I know are familiar with that. We see that in our clinical work. So this is a very brief and long, example from the book of, and the book is filled with those examples, as you know, right? Filled with those stories of things that we unconsciously know, unconsciously transmitted to us, and somehow shape our lives in ways that we cannot fully understand.
And this is why when I read your book, I fell in love with it because you talk about the unconscious and how it shapes our lives and how it kind of merges and leads us places to have potentially regression or repetitive experiences, maybe not of our own, but of our ancestors, and why it fits so beautifully into my frame with spending time at Pacifica, which is depth psychology, more Jungian in orientation, and spending time really studying Marion Woodman and her kind of putting forward that the unconscious lives in the body.
Yeah.
And this piece of how does that come forward? And I'm curious to hear from you how you've seen maybe that relationship of people starting to become conscious of some of their unconscious material and how you've maybe noticed that shifts how they show up in their body or how they relate to the body.
Yeah, I love this. And I'll tell you why. There is a line in my book where I write that when our mind remembers, our body is free to forget, which means, right, that our body, there is almost like a secret contract between our minds and our bodies. And right, an agreement that what the mind cannot afford, I would say, to remember, the body would do for it. And how we release our body is through helping the mind remember. What does it mean, remember? It's not concrete remembering of experiences. It is actually making something, metabolize something, right? Making something tangible, making something an experience that we can tolerate thinking about, as opposed to just depositing it in the body that so to speak thinks it for us, right? And often what you see, especially in generational trauma, but not only, right? I mean, I think that that's a very known psychoanalytic idea and Jungian idea for sure, that we often feel things in our bodies and we carry it out, and in that way we carry it outside of awareness, right? So emotional inheritance is often carried outside of our awareness, either in our body, in our dreams, in our physical symptoms, in our emotional symptoms, of course, right? So, and it appears in the choices we make, in the choices we cannot make, and it's all of that is very, maybe I'll call it slippery, because we are connected to a previous generation that could not think about it. Do you know what I mean? It's like when the previous generation, because trauma shatters us, trauma doesn't allow us to think, and we are connected to that. Some people describe it as a hole, as an empty hole of that we are left with when we're traumatized. And the next generation would be connected to that part of the parents. What we want to help the next generation, because the next generation has the privilege to do so, because they're a little bit far from the original pain, is to make connections and to think, as opposed to stay loyal to a system, parent-child system, that cannot think, that cannot afford thinking. Because when we are traumatized, what does it mean we cannot afford thinking? Knowing and touching trauma too much could cause us emotional fragmentation. So we really recruit all of the defenses we have, including dissociation, of course. So the main one is dissociation, to make sure that we keep our system safe, that we won't fall apart, that we're not going to be fragmented. Right? That's the parents we live with. The next generation has to really be able to change that system,
Mhm.
able to think and be able to get a little closer to pain.
Do you feel like the next generation is in some ways reconciling the fragmentation? Would that be kind of a part of what potentially the psyche or the unconscious is doing, is kind of merging those
Yeah,
pieces that are left behind back together as much as it can?
I think that's exactly right, and it's a beautiful way to say it. That they 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 try to put the pieces together, in the Bionian idea of attacks on linking, and that the trauma does create attacks on linking. What the next generation does is put together with the pieces that are left behind, meaning also making connections, right? Even the most simple connections, that it's not just so abstract, it's even the simple connection between past, present, and future, right? You sit with a patient and they make a connection, a link, recover a link, maybe I should say, even, right? Because between what's happening to them and what's happening to their mother. I'll give you an example so it won't sound too abstract. Like, I had a workshop, and I always tell that story because the person gave me permission to tell that story. When at the end of the workshop, I asked people about their experiences and what they learned about themselves. And interestingly, it was a workshop for clinicians. But as I'm probably going to tell you soon, I think that the clinical work, both on the patient side and the therapist side, is an emotional work. We bring ourselves. So my workshops for clinicians are very experimental. And I bring, like, I talk about us as humans, not about the sick patient and the healthy analyst, right? But the human mind.
Mm.
And that patient, that participant at the end, when I asked, so how did you feel and what did you learn about yourself? She said, I was able to make a connection that I was never able to make before. And, when we talk about enigmatic, we think, oh, you find out something new and you were able to connect it. But no, this is something she already knew. The ability to recover, to make connection and recover something from the past is the ability to break dissociation. It's the ability to think and to connect an information she already knew about her family, but never created the link between the fact that she became a therapist. It was her second career, but in her first career, she was a midwife. And as we were talking, she said, I suddenly realized something that was not a secret. I knew about it, that my grandmother died during childbirth. And somehow I chose to become a midwife. And until this moment, I never made this connection. And I think that from the outside, it feels like, why wouldn't you make this connection? It's such an obvious connection, right? That you became a midwife in order to repair something from your own family trauma. But our mind is almost, I would say, programmed to for fragmentation, right? To not make those connections. So what the second generation does is recover that ability.
I absolutely adore this idea of recovering the connection and bringing it back together. And you said something earlier that kind of piqued my curiosity to hear more in regards to how we recover connection to ourselves, but also to others. You spoke about how trauma leaves a hole. And
Mhm.
what was going through my mind when you spoke of that is just the importance of eros and vitality in trauma recovery. And I would love to just hear from you how the space of potentially eros and sexuality maybe plays out in the second generation if there has been this hole and vitality is absent or missing.
Listen, I love that you brought desire into it because, it's interesting. At the beginning, when I started writing about emotional inheritance, I was teaching desire. I wrote The Enigma of Desire. I was teaching for years at NYU postdoc, the postdoctoral program for psychotherapy and psychoanalysis, where I'm a faculty member. I was teaching the class on sexuality for many years. And then when I started writing emotional inheritance, I thought to myself, what an interesting shift right? And then as I started writing the book, I realized that I'm actually dealing with I'm interested in the same topics, which is life and death.
Hmm.
And desire is a force that motivates us to move forward. It's like you said, it's the eros, it's the life, connects us with life. It's the force that connects us with, that engages us to, that motivates us to create, even to love, right? It's not just about sex. It's an urge. And I think that in a lot of my work, I really talk about that tension that could be also dialectic tension between life and death, between creation and destruction. And how do we think about both? What is a defense against what? How do we, right? How do we sit? So I love that question about the connection between emotional inheritance and desire. And I think that's probably, I never thought about that question actually, but my intuitive answer to that is that there is no doubt that our emotional inheritance will impact our ability to desire, probably in both directions, to tell you the truth. Both it what I mean is that it doesn't only damage our ability to desire, it also probably adds to that ability. And I'm thinking of, as I say that, I'm thinking about the first chapter of emotional inheritance, where I talk about Eve, who is involved in an affair, and we really try to understand what brought her. What did she need? What was the desire? And here it's a sexual and obviously emotional affairs are not only sexual, ever, 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 right? They're always emotional. And we ask ourselves as therapists, like, what is the emotional need there? And again, I could talk about that topic forever, right? See, you're laughing, but it's true. It's like there are so many motivations that I could talk about related to affairs, specifically here, because we're connecting desire with emotional inheritance. It was about the transmission of deadness in her family. Meaning, again, not to make this too abstract, when you read the chapter, you really understand that her mother was connected, attached to a mother who died, and which to some degree killed a piece of her, which made her herself a dead mother to her children. And what Eve was really trying to fight is the deadness inside her. And what is a better technique to fight deadness, if not eros, right? So what we find is that many people, and that is in the research, that have affairs, when therapists ask them what happened in their lives in the last year, you would find that many of them experienced loss. And that through some, sometimes perverse, by the way, I'm not endorsing that, right? But I think that to some degree, this is our job as analysts, is to really understand what brought you here. Because people are not just, speaking of destruction and creation, they're not just destructive, People don't just do things to destroy their lives. They do it because somewhere unconsciously they believe that there is something that they can get, even if they're not fully, right, that it could give them, and even if they're not fully aware of it. And in Eve's case, it was absolutely the wish to stay alive, to enliven herself, to deal with the deadness inside her. So I know it was a long answer to your question about desire and intergenerational trauma.
But it was perfect. And I would love if you could dive into the concept of the dead mother. Because when I read that first chapter, I was so hooked because I have a mother who has a lot of sexual trauma and has experienced a lot of abuse in her life. And I know that for me, that created such a response of like, oh, I'm going to be like as open, as big, as desirous as like all of these things so that I never feel the deadness inside me. And I would say that was like up until 27, I just lived there. And then I had a kind of a moment where I was like, oh, actually, this might not be serving me, just, living in opposition to my mother's reaction. And I found that so helpful. And how you described the dead mother to be so helpful. So I would love if you could lean into that a little bit for the listener today.
Thank you for asking this the way you did, because I'm going to start where you stopped, okay? Because I think that what you're saying is that often when we have dead, and again, as an aside, the dead mother is a concept that was developed by a French analyst named Andre Green. And I think that it's not a misogynistic term. It was basically created in the times where mothers were the people who were the main caretakers. So you can replace the mother with the father, or whoever takes them is the main child's caretaker, knowing even before attachment theory, actually, that we are so dependent on our caretakers, and we need them to invite us into this life, right, with their own desire for our being. We need them to want us. We need them to nourish us. We need them to give us healthy nourishment as opposed to toxic nourishment, right? And we need their aliveness. And I think that concept really speaks to a emotional dynamic in which the main caretaker, the mother in that sense, your mother or other people's mother or father, are in some ways emotionally dead, either because they are struggling with loss. And I think that's the main, Andre Green really focused on that, on parents that are struggling, obviously emotionally, but struggling with, especially with loss, that they are depressed or they struggle emotionally in other ways that leaves them unable to be connected to their children and bring their own aliveness, and to just to keep our conversation about desire, right, into the relationship with the child. So what the child is experiencing is a parent that is a little bit checked out, or preoccupied, right? Preoccupied with loss, preoccupied with something else. And what Andre Green is really saying is that when you have a parent like that, but you actually need the parent so much, you will try to meet that, let's say, mother wherever she is. If she's dead, you're going to kill parts of yourself and meet her in her deadness. As long as you're together, you're going to adapt and be tuned into where the parent is. in an attempt to enliven her. What you're describing is often the second step,
Yes,
right?
that was my first part of my life. And then the second part, as soon as I had autonomy and agency. So you're right on cue.
Right? So you
Yeah,
do want to say something about that, and then we'll formulate it for your listeners. Like what are
absolutely.
the first
Yeah.
and the second phases of that?
The first part of my life until I had autonomy and agency was like as much as I could meet her in that place, I did as much as I could. And that's why when as soon as I, got some autonomy and agency and started modeling or being engaged in the world in that way, there was this complete flip in my
Mhm.
personality
Yeah.
because
Yeah.
it was like finally I was out of that. And then I spent so many years of my life being like, I'm never going to touch the deadness again because I
Mhm.
had to live there for 13 years and it was awful.
Yeah.
So the second stage, you can pick it up there.
Yeah, I'll pick it up there because I think Under Green actually did not get there. And I
Mhm.
think that is he would really focus on the first step. And I think that what happened in the second stage is those kids, not every kid could do that, but those kids who have agency, those kids who are able to go out of the house, and be out there, are becoming defended against deadness. They don't want to touch deadness. They want aliveness, And I have patients that the mother was very, very, very absent and dead, and the child is partying and she's going out and she's you're smiling, and that because what we're fighting is not only the not wanting to be like the parent and not wanting to be locked in that metaphorically in that dark room, but also the deadness inside us that we internalize, right? So many years you're in this room and there is a part of you that is right, that is identified with the parent. You need to fight something very, very, with all the power you have, with all the force you have. You need to really fight that deadness inside you. That was even that story, right? And I think as you move on, there is another stage, right? And that's, you're already saying that you're in the third stage where you start integrating. You're not just working against something, because working against something is very tiring, and it is still dialoguing with the original problem, right? You start integrating life and death. You start integrating being alive and feeling dead. You start really integrating all the parts of yourself. And so, I mean, I don't know if there is anything you want to say about that stage.
Absolutely. I have noticed a deep softening, whereas now there isn't this resistance, and it actually does feel like authentic or aligned autonomy. I loved how you said, I'm not still in dialogue with that past history. And that was something that, as both a clinician and just a human, that I really took from emotional inheritance was this question of how am I still in dialogue with these stories and experiences that are mine and also many that aren't mine? Where am
Yeah.
I still living in reaction to a history of immigration or poverty or gender based violence?
Mhm, mhm.
Where have I, why did I dedicate so much of my career to sexual crime and war based violence, sexual war based violence? Well, when I look at my history, I know exactly, but that's actually not living with agency and autonomy. That's living in reaction and getting to be that corrective experience in someone else's story that maybe still lives inside me. And I would love to hear from you, you know, how much of that plays out into the work that you do with people, because I don't assume that people come in and want to explore their emotional inheritance. Maybe they do now.
Yeah.
How you
Like,
subtly weave that into their awareness.
yeah. Yeah, I love everything you're saying because I was thinking as you were speaking that to some degree, the dialogue with our parents is always there. And what you were saying is that what it becomes is maybe a soft dialogue, right? It's not a reaction to, it's not like we need a muscle to push something away or to do something against. It becomes a dialogue with, like every dialogue we have that is not so loaded. I do want to add something before I answer your question, that to that dynamic that we were talking about the dead mother and deadness. I think that when we are able to go through these stages, we are lucky, because I'm sure that some of the people that listen to us also could not do that. And those people are usually people of parents, mother or father dead mother or father. And I'm reminding that we're talking about metaphorically dead.
Mhm.
Is harder in some ways, right? Than dealing with something that is so clear and so out there in reality. Emotionally dead, that don't let the child have, the word you were using is autonomy. Do not let the child go out. And they, in some ways, a lot of narcissistic parents are especially are forcing the child to stay next to them and not leave their bedside. So we have to remember that the ability to go through movement, right? Motion and traction is what we're looking for. And so that brings me back to answer your question, because I think that first of all, you're right. Until I wrote Emotional Inheritance, nobody came to my to therapy with me to explore their emotional inheritance. It's only in the last few years that people start coming with that as the presenting problem. And as we know, the presenting problem always has something underneath that as well. So even if they come with that, there are other things that we talk about. So there is a dialectic, there of past and generational trauma and their own trauma and thinkings about the future. But part of what we always do is make the dialogue, the unconscious dialogue with your parents and grandparents and parts of yourself conscious. Because if we assume that there is always a dialogue, and we were talking before about like how is that the intense dialogue, we have to remember that a big part of that dialogue is usually unconscious. We're not aware of it. That means that we're not aware of it, right? What we want to do is to be aware of that dialogue. And to be, for example, what you were saying is to be aware that, in fact, a lot of what you are doing is because you want to repair your parents' trauma or your mother's trauma, right? You still do that, but you don't always you're not always aware of it. So what we want, our goal is to make you aware of that the choices you make are related to your unconscious wish that at that point to repair the past. That said, when you're more aware of it, it doesn't mean that you're not going to do it, but it means that you can again have a more of an ability to choose. Then you can choose. You can still choose to do that. You can still say, you know what, that's what I have in my mother's history, and I would like to dedicate my life to doing this and this and that, right? But at least you do it, and that's to me the empowering thing about being in therapy, right? You make I'll use the word that you used before. You become an active agent. You make active choices. You don't just unconsciously find yourself someday, you realize, oh, this is where I found myself. I'm not sure why, right? And so you develop agency uh, in your ability to really understand where you come from and where you want to go.
That was one of the things that I took from your book when I read it was this deep, actually piece of self-forgiveness that
Mm.
even though at that point when I read it, I could see myself still in historical patterns, there
Mhm.
became this moment where it was like, oh, but I am actively choosing to relive this intergenerational story.
Mhm.
I'm not just being swept up in it. And I was able to move out of that story. And now it's not as murky, but it gave me this place of understanding actually, this might be a part of the healing is
Yeah.
being in these same stories, but me choosing to participate in them, not me just being passively stolen or swept up in them again. And that is also one of the reasons why I really love your book. And I I recommend or give it away to like all of my clients. I'm like, please, this will be foundational for our work. If you want to understand where we're going, just please take this book. Is that it's not written as a self-help book, but it is like deeply self-reflective. And I would love to hear from you how you held that in the writing process of trying to encourage that depth of self-reflection. It felt so refreshing for me in a book that I just found on the self-help show section, because that is actually where I found it.
Thank you for saying that. I think that what happened with emotional inheritance was really, I did not expect it, and it was so moving for me for many reasons. I think one is that therapeutic community really embraced me, and I know that I didn't think about it, of course, when I wrote it as a very, very personal piece. I didn't think about sorry readers, but I didn't think about the readers. I thought about I was really, really in my own bubble, and I can tell you a little bit about that experience, but it was like I was so moved by how therapists responded to that book and the way that it helped therapists to bring their own patients or assist their patients in explaining something that's really hard to explain. And also, as I know that as an analyst myself, I don't sit with patients and explain to them theory. It's not like we're saying, oh, this is how it works. And we're working with them and we're sitting with them in the moment. And so I think sometimes we send them to read a book or to do something, and then they come with their own rich ideas and thoughts and fantasies and dreams that come, right, that is integrated with the therapy. So that was a very, very moving thing for me. And the other piece was people who are not clinicians, that clinicians know the idea of intergenerational transmission of trauma. It's not a new idea. But for people who are not clinicians, what I heard is that for many people, that was something they've never heard of. And emotional inheritance was a new idea. So I think that was very meaningful to me, that people actually, some people tell me it changed my life. So I feel like, oh, there is something about knowing, like making connections. Again, we're going back to the idea of making connections between past and present. That suddenly you have an aha moment. Now, talking about self-help, the truth is that I believe people change through experiences. It's what I said about therapy. In therapy, we don't teach our patients. And therapists who teach their patients, I don't think they're as helpful as therapists who connect with their patients and live life with them and experience their experiences with them and their own emotional range that lives with their patients. So what I really wanted is to take myself and anyone who reads this book with me into a therapeutic journey, to open a space for reflection, for aha moments, for awareness, to think about their lives, about other people, about life, I guess, in general. And my hope is for an emotional experience that is healing on its own. That you read a book, how books, not just what we call self-help books. Actually, in my mind, self-help books are usually the least helpful. It's like, it is good literature that you read something and you're like, wow, that changed something in who I am, right? So what I try to do in the book is have both, and have the emotional experience and also teach you a little bit about how to think about it.
Was it intentional for you as a writer? And I ask you this question because I'm in the process of writing a book.
Uh-huh.
Did you intend to have so much intimacy with your reader? Or do you just have that level of intimacy with yourself and your own thoughts and your own inheritance that maybe it wasn't intentional? It was just like deeply embodied. And I ask this question because I don't like self-help books. Like I equally find them unhelpful. I'm like, I remember a time in my life where I read all of them and none of them
Yeah.
did much for me. And that was deeply frustrating. And, I still
Yeah.
have a little bit of a story around them. So when I read your book, it was such a shift. I just had read clinical pieces for so long. So it was this shift for me. And that's what really broke me into your work was just feeling you as the writer and also feeling your clients' stories as well, in my own body and in my own psyche in this different way. So I am curious if that was intentional.
I think that you're right. It's not, it's more the embodiment because the truth is, we can't fake intimacy.
Mhm.
It's not something you could do. And I think that for me, it was more about the intimacy between me and my patients that I was trying to bring the reader into. I wanted you to be as if you are kind of a visitor, right? In my office and in my head. You're a visitor in my head, and you can hear my thoughts, my most, my most messy thoughts, I want to say, because thoughts are never just clean and beautiful, right? And I share many thoughts. Some of them are smart, some of them are sad, some of them are helpful, and some of them are not helpful, and then the reflection on that, right? So it really is about the human's mind. And I liked when you talked before about forgiveness, because I think part of it is really about forgiving ourselves and accepting ourselves. What I feel is that in therapy, we're so focused on changing ourselves or changing people as therapists. And for me, not the only form of change, but one of the most meaningful forms of change is acceptance. Accept yourself. And it's almost paradoxical, right? Because you think, what do you mean accept myself? I want to change myself. I don't want to accept myself. But I think that acceptance and change are dialectically related, and change, acceptance is a change for many, many people. So that was, to me, the acceptance is not just like superficial demand of our patients or ourselves, like, yeah, you have to accept yourself, but it is much more of a deep, deep process of, like, what does it mean really even to accept, and what do we want to accept, and how do we do that? And so for me, that is related to intimacy too, right? And if you think about, and my next book is going to be on the topic of intimacy. So I'm thinking like that part of what I'm in the process of thinking about now is like, what part of intimacy with ourselves and with others is about um, grieving what we are not, to mourning everything we cannot have, we cannot do, we cannot be, and our partners cannot be, will never be, cannot give us, all of that spectrum. Um, which I think in emotional inheritance, I really just, I was a little selfish. I'm telling you the truth. I didn't think about my readers so much. I was more concerned about my patients and getting their permission and wanting to really, uh, describe them in a way that was truthful and describe my own emotional experience.
I love that. As you were speaking, you kind of brought it up there, but it circled back in my mind was this piece of life and death and how that is kind of, again, when you spoke of intimacy, how that is both there, like the loss and the desire. And I would love to potentially just kind of close our time together by asking you a final question of how someone can start to reconcile those themes of life and death, desire and loss in when they are starting to look at their emotional inheritance.
It's a very difficult question, but I'll say one thing that I think is probably the key for all of those things. And that is the idea of going toward pain.
Mm.
We, as young children, will learn that we should stay away from anything that is too difficult, too painful. And I think that definitely those of us who are children of traumatized parents, because traumatized parents often, in the workbook, I talk about they either give it to us as in a form, as in a form of too muchness or not enoughness. Right. And I'm thinking about even our instinct that when we feel pain, we want to run away. And for me, therapy, if it's with a therapist or with yourself or with a community or really understanding who you are, requires going towards pain, requires going towards the areas that you actually prefer to avoid. And maybe that connects everything, including life and death in it, right?
Thank you so much for your time and your work. And thank you on behalf of my clients. So many of them have loved your book. And it's given us such a structure and shared language of where we're going and where the process is taking us. I know you just have your workbook that's come out. Do you have anything else that you would like the listener to know that you have coming out or is upcoming?
The followers can follow me on Instagram. That's where I post events that I'm doing. I'm running a workshop for clinicians. I teach a lot of clinicians this work. So, and that's where everything exists these days. So
we will have all your details so people will be able to find you again. Thank you so much for your time. It was lovely to get to spend some time with you today.
Thank you so, so much. I deeply enjoyed the conversation with you.
If you found value in this episode, it would mean so much to me for you to share the podcast with friends, a loved one, or on your social platforms. If you have the time, please rate and review the podcast so that this podcast reaches a larger audience and can inspire more and more humans to connect to their bodies too. Thank you for being here and nurturing the relationship you have with your very own body.